My task is to just say what I came here to say and not get off into tangents addressing what Valerie and Root have said and trying to pull it all together in some way. We'll save that for afterwards. So as a long-time happiness researcher, I've tended to want to just kind of get on with it, just measure it and find out what causes it. So I haven't done as much philosophical thinking about this question as I should, but I've found out a lot of stuff, and I want to share some of it with you, and we'll see where that takes us. So I have two major talk goals. The first one is to make a case for a somewhat narrower conception and measure of well-being than the one Marty proposes. So not the big temple, but something a little smaller and maybe more manageable. And second goal I have is to make some comparisons between Marty's temple, I like that phrase, and self-determination theory, which is a theory I've been working with for a long time now. And there's really some striking parallels that I think are worth taking note of. All right, so basically what I'm going to do is say, instead of thinking of well-being this way, as having all this stuff in it inside of one big bubble, I'm going to suggest that we think of it this way. It's as something smaller, which is especially affected by three different psychosocial experiences or basic psychological needs. And it might just be a matter of preference, which way, where you draw the boundary, but I think I'm going to try to convince you that it's useful to keep it smaller and to maybe put things in this sequence. Okay, so what is happiness? If you're going to do science, you have to define it and measure it. And you start to look at the field, and there are constructs that all seem related to happiness in some way or another. There's measures of all these things. They're floating around out there. And what do we want to call happiness? Do we want to say that all these things are happiness, that all of them go inside the bubble? Maybe creativity not so much. Maybe there's other things outside the bubble, but there's a lot in there. And I would say that that's too much. Alternatively, you could, based on some theory or another, make the bubble smaller. You could say, okay, my theory says these are the main things that, or the way we should define and measure happiness. Or you could say it's meaning, relationships, and achievements, as in Marty's 4 pillars scheme. Or you could say it's positive affect, low negative affect, and life satisfaction, which is what a lot of well-being researchers content themselves with. They use that particular definition. Stepping back, it's kind of a bigger picture on how to do science, how people do science. You can make a distinction between lumpers and splitters. A lumper is somebody who takes a gestalt view of a definition. I'll just put them both up. A lumper sees things grouped into larger categories and kind of blurs distinctions and put things together in a big single group. Whereas a splitter is somebody that wants to break things down. So in biology, creating the different taxa, how do we arrange the species and the subspecies and the kingdoms and the orders? A lumper would focus on the biggest groupings and not care so much about the details. The problem with that is you might lose information. Whereas on the other hand, if you're too much of a splitter, you're creating all this information and you're maybe not getting to the explanation that we want, the parsimonious understanding. In my research, empirical research, I've done a lot of it. Typically, this is the definition of well-being that I use. And actually, it's not just me. I have some good support. Ed Diener, probably the world's best-known happiness guru, or one of them, University of Illinois, thinks of well-being primarily in this term. And I think he does it for kind of the same reason that I do, that he doesn't really want to get into the philosophical issues so much. He wants to keep values and content out of it so you can then see what relates to it. I'll say more about that in a minute. But the reason I like mood is that it's a biologically based response mode of the human organism. It's built in, it can't be faked, it's just your natural response. And the question is what provokes or elicits positive versus negative responding. Global life satisfaction I also like because it's just a summary judgment about how things are in your life. It doesn't have values mixed up in it. It doesn't have content mixed up in it. And what this lets you do is, well, I'll just give you an example. Here's some typical ways that I measure these things. And this is the items from the PANAS, the positive affect, negative affect schedule. You could try to make some ratings yourself if you liked. Most people are, about a 4 on the positive affect items and about a 2 on the negative affect items. These are life satisfaction items from Diener's life satisfaction scale. What I typically do is kind of combine them into one composite. And that's the formula that I use. PA plus life satisfaction minus NA. Well, what does that do for you? Well, I was actually able to get Marty's temple, but I had to scan it. I couldn't copy it and paste it, so I dug out an old scanner, and so there it is. So the 4 pillars, or the temple approach, I actually don't disagree with it. I'm just not sure it's the most useful way to look at these questions. I think it's kind of a lumper way of looking at well-being. And let me explain what I mean. Thank you, Valerie, for bringing up this example already. There's this common phrase, happiness is a warm puppy. And my question is happiness a warm puppy, or is a warm puppy something that might bring happiness? Happiness is a warm gun. Is that happiness, or is it something that might bring happiness? Well, maybe only for a special type of person would a warm gun bring happiness. I was doing a search on happiness is a blank, and I stumbled into this one. Happiness is a warm porta-john. I don't know if you can see this, but there's these 2 porta-johns. He's going under this bridge. They're about to be knocked into this woman's convertible. Obviously, happiness is not that. But the point that I'm making is that these phrases mix up potential causes of happiness with happiness itself. It puts them inside the happiness bubble. And I'm going to suggest let's keep them outside the happiness bubble. And in fact, let's keep all psychosocial content. It's kind of an abstract phrase, but you'll see what I mean. Let's keep those out so that we are not putting our values onto what happiness is. We can test what causes happiness and which values do or don't, which kinds of experiences do or don't. But let's don't build into the definition certain experiences or values that we think ought to be important. But maybe they aren't. Maybe they're culturally bound. Abraham Maslow got a lot of criticism for maybe projecting his Western cultural values onto his descriptions of self-actualized people. And I actually think he did a good job. I like his work, but I think it's a valid criticism. And it's also a little paternalistic to say that this is the right value or this is the right kind of experience, and if you're having that, then you're happy. Well, what I would rather do is keep the value-free measure and then test all these other things, anything that you like, as a predictor of happiness. So you could find out, okay, do people with warm puppies, are they happier than people without warm puppies? There might be a tiny effect there, but not much of one. Warm guns, probably not. Self-esteem, purpose, relationships, achievements, let's find out. And our goal is to find a parsimonious set of what produces happiness. We don't want 10 things, that's too many. We don't want just one. In Marty's chapter, he talks about monist theories that say happiness is just one thing. According to Freud, avoiding anxiety. According to Nietzsche, gaining power. We don't want just one. We don't want 10. That's too many. Let's try to find something midway that actually empirically can be shown to predict happiness. You can also do experiments with this kind of approach. You bring people into the lab, you give them some kind of relatedness or relationship experience or an achievement experience or something that boosts their self-esteem or a warm gun. And you see how that affects their mood and feelings at that time. Okay, so what I'm going to suggest is that the temple approach that Marty has outlined is kind of a lumper perspective, which doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You know, it depends on your purpose, and for some purposes, I think it's fine to do it the way he suggested. There are other approaches in well-being theory that are kind of doing the same thing. They keep making it bigger. I personally don't really like it. I just don't think it's that useful to keep putting more stuff inside the bubble. Here's some of the problems. Actually, here's another example. Sol and Huppert Marty presents some of this data on the European nations and their flourishing. Flourishing is defined in terms of all of these things. And these guys actually have a sort of a menu system where if you've got 3 from this column and 2 from that column, then you're flourishing. Like, where do you get that from? I just want to let the data speak about what's actually producing a value-free, content-free measure of psychological well-being or subjective well-being. All right, so what's the problem with putting a lot inside the well-being bubble? I think there's a couple. One of them is if you are going to carve nature, you want to carve it at its joints. How do you find the joints? Well, you do factor analysis, statistical technique where you find out, you know, when people are answering these questions, how many different kinds of ideas or underlying concepts are they using in answering the questions. And when you factor analyze the whole set of variables inside of Marty's temple, you don't get one factor. You can have accomplishments, but not relationships. You can have meaning, but not engagement. They don't all change together. There's several different things that are being lumped. And you can lose information if you do that. That doesn't mean that you can't also learn some important stuff, but at the very least, I think you have to go in and look at it construct by construct and see what you've got. I actually get the lumping critique myself just for combining PA, LifeSat, and NA into one composite. Reviewers will sometimes say, no, you shouldn't do that. You should present each one separately. And, if they insist, I will do that. I'll present them separately. But I'd rather present them together because usually they do form one factor. They do go together for the most part. But even these three can break apart. And here's an example. We have some data where we asked Facebook users and violent video gamers to stop for 48 hours. Go cold turkey. Stop doing it. How did it affect them? It seemed to be a good thing. Their life satisfaction went up. Their negative affect went down. They procrastinated less. They were less aggressive and hostile, according to their own self-reports. So it benefited them to stop, except their positive affect went down as well. So to me, that was very interesting. It's like you're using these media and you're getting positive mood like an addiction, but you're paying a cost in life satisfaction and getting more procrastination and more negative affect. So there was a case where even my degree of lumping was too much, and it was good that I broke it down. Second problem, practical utility. The more you put inside that circle, the less there is outside the circle to look at as predictors. It's suddenly everything good is inside. What are you going to leave outside to predict it, to understand what causes it? You've got to have some of those things outside. And a related problem, the more variables you put inside the circle, it's kind of like the kitchen sink. You're putting everything in there, and what that means is more and more things that remain outside are going to correlate with the inside just because everything's in there. And it just becomes less informative. And as I study longitudinal changes in well-being, and if I'm studying changes in the kitchen sink, everything's going to predict that, but I won't really have learned anything at the end of my study. All right, so there's a lot of reasons why you might want to combine these variables, and I think Marty makes some very good points, some good arguments about why this can be useful. But one thing that I'm in some disagreement about is what I call the myth of the happy hedonist. So there's this distinction that goes back to Aristotle between hedonia and eudaimonia. And the idea is you can have pleasure or you can have virtue, but you can't have both. That these are in contrast. And a lot of happy people, this is what their happiness is about. They're just out there having pleasure. People who are way happier than you or I, and they've lost their moral compass, but it doesn't matter because they're just having a great time, and that's all they care about. I think it's kind of a false dichotomy between these two theories of happiness. I mean, they really go together pretty strongly. There's a great article by Kashtan, King, and Diener, Biswas Diener in Journal of Positive Psychology, making the argument that we're paying too much lip service to this noble conception of happiness versus this mere pleasure conception, and it's exaggerated, and I tend to agree with that point of view. And one of the reasons is that if you actually look at the data, the happy hedonist, it is a myth. There's not such a person, or those people are rare. A person who's all about pleasure and materialism and consumption tends not to be happy. They have less positive affect, not more. They are ignoring the important things in their life. They are compensating. They're trying to get some kind of satisfaction, but it's not very much. And they tend to, if they do manage to get positive affect, it's compromised. People don't like them. They are selfish and superficial. They're not working or moving towards their best potentials. So what I'm saying is that we can rely on the human organism, and just in terms of life satisfaction, positive affect, and negative affect, to tell us whether that person is thriving. That simpler definition and measure lets us distinguish, lets us identify the unhappy hedonist. It lets us find out that no, hedonism is not a good approach. Having materialism at the top of your value system is not a good value system. We don't have to take those things and put them inside the circle. Let's leave them outside and test what they do. All right, so then what are the more important psychosocial contents or qualitative factors that we can go out and test as predictors of happiness? I work with self-determination theory. I dug up these pictures of Ed and Rich. This could be a matter of debate, but I think it's the world's most developed theory of agency. It's a very complex theory. It's been under development for 40 years. It probably takes about a year to learn it and understand it. I'm not going to go very far into it. It is, I think, naturally aligned with positive psychology because it makes the assumption that default human nature is positive, that we have a desire to grow, to internalize, to contribute to others, and that we will do those things unless the context sabotages us. So it fits with positive psychology. Again, I'm not going to say that much about it, except one of the most important assumptions of it is that human beings evolved 3 basic psychological needs because they provide adaptive benefits. People who want these 3 experiences thrive and survive. Autonomy, doing what interests you and expresses your identity, being self-regulating. We've been talking about the free will question the last couple of days. Bound to come up with philosophers, actually comes up a lot even with psychologists. Self-determination theory says the feeling of autonomy or free will is very important. It might be an illusion, but if you've got it, you're going to be a happier person. And the theory is really about the relationship between authorities and subordinates, parents and children, teachers and students, coaches and athletes, bosses and employees. And to be able to feel a sense of autonomy within a context is very important. Second basic need, competence, the feeling that whatever it is that you're doing, you are able to do it well, to be approaching mastery and greater skillfulness. And the third need, called the need for relatedness. Some people call it belongingness, connectedness. We're a social species. We want to feel solidarity with at least some other people. Not everybody, but at least some others. So here's a list. Valerie was talking about what makes it onto the list. We try to, justify or provide data to say, okay, this should be on the list and other things shouldn't be. I wanted to throw this out first. We were having dinner in a Chinese restaurant in Las Vegas, my family and I, and just fortuitously, 3 of the 5 of us got a fortune cookie relevant to SDT's 3 needs. So this shows it's not just something made up by academic psychologists, right? It's out there in the culture.
What were the other 2?
I don't remember. Something not memorable. Okay, so one thing I want to point out is that there's really quite a similarity between what's inside of Marty's temple and what SDT is proposing as basic needs. The relationships pillar is the need for relatedness. Accomplishments pillar is the need to feel competence and effectiveness in what one does. There's a little bit of a similarity between meaning and purpose and autonomy. I don't really have time to go into it, but according to self-determination theory, meaning is an outcome. If you're feeling autonomous, competent, and related in your life, then your life will be meaningful. It will just, that will tend to result, just as well-being will tend to result. So what's the difference? And I'm not sure that we're even in disagreement about this, but according to SDT, the needs are like nutrients. They're like psychological vitamins that are required to produce well-being. They're not part of well-being. They're not components of it. As such, then, you can try to implement them, program them, create a context that boosts them in order to boost people's happiness. And so what we would try to do in applying self-determination theory would say, this is our criterion, except we would include, or I would include, low negative affect and high life satisfaction, and we would try to verify that these 3 things all predict it or predict changes in it. All right, so I'm going to just go through a little bit of research, data that we've collected relevant to these claims. First of all, how do you establish that what's on the list really should be on the list? You can't just throw it out there and argue for it and get it published. You've got to provide data. One 2001 study that we conducted. This is actually the only study I ever did that got worldwide attention. APA did a press release on it. My phone didn't stop ringing for 3 weeks. Hi, you're on the air with 1,000 or 10,000 lunchtime listeners in metropolitan Detroit. Okay, I'll go through my spiel again. It was kind of fun, but I was glad when it was over. What we did was we worked backwards. We said if there are certain basic satisfactions inherent to human nature, well, how do we identify them? Well, let's have people identify the most satisfying event that they can think of for some recent period of time, maybe the last month, the last week. We tried different time frames. Here's some examples of the kinds of things people would say. High school graduation, I broke 6 minutes, we cooked an awesome meal together. So there it is, what people think is satisfying. We're going to trust the human organism to, tell us what feels good to it, and then we're going to find out what is it about, what makes it satisfying. We tested 10 candidate psychological needs, including autonomy, competence, and relatedness, but also we had pleasure and stimulation, so there's hedonism right there. Self-esteem, money, luxury, safety, security. These came from different need theories, Abraham Maslow's theory, other theories. There's meaning. We put that into the mix, and we let them duke it out to see which would win. A couple ways of determining the winner. One was what was rated as most present within people's satisfying experiences. Well, it turns out that the three I wanted to see were at the top of the list. Self-esteem was up there as well. Self-determination theory does not say self-esteem is a need. It's a little complex. I don't want to get into it, but I think the best summary is it's good to have self-esteem. It's not good to pursue it. Let it come by itself, but don't make your life about getting it. But you notice that meaning, at least the way we defined and measured it, was not in the top group. The reason APA put out the press release was because status and money were at the bottom. I mean, we knew that was going to come out because it always comes out that way. The human organism knows that's not what is satisfying. Most of us know that. Money can't buy you love, right? We all know that. We had a second way of testing which are the basic needs. People were describing peak experiences, but what were the most peak experiences? Well, they were the ones we had people rate the degree of positive affect, satisfaction associated with the event that they described, and then what predicted those feelings of satisfaction. Again, it was autonomy, competence, relatedness, and self-esteem. Ed and Rich don't like it, but that's what the data said. Again, those other candidates didn't come out as being what was highly salient within what people identified as satisfying. I created this slide just, for another talk a couple of weeks ago. It amuses me. But I mean, this is kind of the way that we think about it, that these are, again, evolved experiences that we need to have in order to thrive, like vitamins, so to speak. And if we get them, we'll be happy, and if we don't, we won't. Here's another study we did. What makes for a good day? Here's Michael Phelps and the U.S. relay team having a very good day when they won Phelps. I think it was his third gold medal. This study found that it was autonomy, competence, and relatedness in the person on that day. Now, that's a little cryptic, so this gives an example of how we look at data. Here are, it's a 14-day diary study. Here's two people, Michael in red, Sylvia in yellow. Here's their daily well-being score. Here's Michael's average. Here's Sylvia's average. Michael's a happier person on average. We could predict that because he had higher levels of autonomy, competence, and relatedness on average, and trait measures of those things. He was a person that felt those things a lot. But people also have good days and bad days, and it turned out that those three things, experiences, predicted having good days versus bad days. So this was a really good day for Michael. He felt especially high levels of autonomy, competence, and relatedness on this day, creating especially high levels of well-being. Poor Sylvia, this was an especially bad day for her. She's low in general on these three needs, but those days she really didn't get them. Other kinds of data, the best data is an experiment. This was a 2x2x2 where we had people learn to play the game of Boggle. And the experimenter, in leading them through the process, either gave them lots of choice or told them what to do like a robot, expressed confidence in their ability to do well, expressed dubiousness that they could, they didn't seem like the type who'd be good at this, expressed interest in where they came from, what they were like, or didn't care at all, supported or denied the three needs, and all three of them had effects on people's feeling and experience during the game. So, this is really the only way to get a cause is to do these kinds of controlled experiments. I do a lot of goal research, ask people to set goals at the beginning of a period of time, and then track how well they do. One thing we almost always find is that if you attain your goals over a period, you will have higher well-being at the end of that period. It feels good to attain goals, although I'm not going to get into the fact that not all goals feel good. Attaining very materialistic goals don't really leave you any better off than you started. But what explained the effects of goal attainment on this change in global well-being was the accumulation of satisfying days, 6 days during the semester. Don't fear. I can explain this diagram. This is a study of 2 different law schools. We were able to track their class from year 1, day 1 of year 1 to graduation. So it's a 3-year study. And one of the schools we knew was more sort of traditional, you could say conservative, status-oriented, the typical model of legal education. And there's some attempts to reform legal education in the U.S. The second school, School 2, was more progressive, you might say, more student-centered, less about making it to the law review and being, kind of a big shot on campus. According to self-determination theory, then, autonomy support, I keep pushing the wrong button. It's really important. Again, authority-subordinate relations, there's a natural tendency for the person in power to exploit it, to overuse it, to be controlling. What we found is that the more progressive school, I'm not allowed to name names, by the second year, end of the first year, I should say, their students felt that the faculty cared more about their choices, cared more about their perspective, and that in turn predicted changes in need satisfaction at the end of the third year. So the more progressive school, they were feeling more autonomous, competent, and related by the time of graduation, which had very interesting effects. All 3 of them predicted increased well-being from year 1 to year 3, and that's what we typically see. Competence, need satisfaction predicted actually higher bar exam performance. The more progressive school, their students actually passed the bar at a higher rate than the less progressive school. And that gets the attention of the deans when you can show some sort of finding like that. Having autonomy needs met predicted going into the legal career, your first job after law school, for more self-determined motivation, which I won't really explain, but it's an important thing to have. So here's my conclusions, preferences, recommendations. Number 1, let's define well-being independently of psychosocial content. Let's keep our values out of it. I'm looking forward to trying to reconcile these perspectives, Valerie and I, because once you a priori put a value in there, A, you can't test it anymore. You've already put it in. And B, you might fall prey to cultural biases, personal biases. And I'm saying let's keep it out and let's see what works. And actually, you can look at values. I've done quite a bit of value research with my colleague Tim Kasser. The High Price of Materialism is a great book that he wrote. And it turns out that people who are highly materialistic or consumption-oriented, you can test that. Does that make people happy? No, it doesn't. Again, the happy hedonist tends to be a myth. Once you figure out what parsimonious set of experiences people really need in order to be happy, then you can go and design your interventions, your programs, your policy recommendations. I actually think that Marty's doing some great stuff with the Army, with the British, to use to bring his PERMA model. And I would tend to agree that that's pretty much what ought to be doing, except I would probably keep meaning out of it. People have to make meaning for themselves, and it's not clear it's that important. It may be something intellectuals worry about more than the average person. So in that sense, I'm not sure I'm really disagreeing in any really important way with what Marty's saying. But I did want to point out that there's quite a bit of precedent and existing data to support these experiences that Marty's added to the temple, the new versus the old theory, and that it might be worth trying to do some more integration of those two separate lines of research. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We now have a full plate for discussion and also for response. And so at this time, I'd like to invite our Tanner lecturer for this year, who certainly by now needs no introduction, Professor Martin Seligman of the University of Pennsylvania.
Well, my comments are spontaneous, and they're divided into 4 sets of comments. The first is the question of the temple versus the shrine, I guess I'd say. That's what's in the bubble and what's outside, and what is the nature, what is this a theory of? The second is the question of dashboard approach to well-being versus a final common path, a one number approach to well-being. This is actually a comment on all 3 of the presentations. The third is the question, what is the place of values in my view of well-being? And does a theory of well-being need to be suffused by values? And then the fourth is, in many ways, bears on the question of agency and what is the relationship of agency. The dinner time conversation that Peter and I had, which I'll talk about, you must take it with many grains of salt, since it's new, and I've been worrying about it for a couple of years and have not been able to quite put together the place of agency. So I will finally suggest that human beings are not particularly driven by the past. Rather, they're drawn by the future, and that's the place of agency. So this is a rather radical premise for psychology. So those are the 4 things I'll do in probably, hope, less than 20 minutes. Root, and in many ways Ken, set up the question of what is this a theory of? So 10 years ago, positive psychology was very much a theory of happiness. It basically said that if we use the gold standard of measures of life satisfaction, then positive emotion, engagement, and meaning all feed into that final common path. And the object of positive psychology was to raise the amount of life satisfaction on the planet. So I gave that theory up. And I think I need to say why I gave it up. This is my essential comment on the theoretical posture of both Root and Ken. What I wanted to explain was what free people chose to do. So importantly, and I think Valerie got it exactly right, well-being theory, flourishing theory, is a theory of choice. So it takes as the set of things it wants to explain what people unconstrained, uncoerced, choose to do. Now, That actually depends on a notion of indifference and neutrality and what it means to be north of neutrality. So that's much too complicated an argument to do now. But I want to claim that notions of choosing positive things that are above indifference, is a well-defined notion. Okay, now given that positive psychology in this incarnation is a theory of choice, then the question is, what is the relationship of happiness to choice? Now, it is commonly and glibly said that we choose the things that we think will make us happy or do make us happy. And that, I think, is profoundly incorrect. And that's where the difference between Root's theory on the one hand, or Ken's, the bubble view, and my theory differ. So I'm after a periodic table of the elements of choice, really nothing less than that. So, but I don't have anything like that. But the question is, what does a periodic table have to contain? So the field is choice. The field is chemistry or compounds by analogy. And the elements are, what defines an element is that people choose these things for their own sake, whether or not they bring any of the others. So by definition, I've argued that people often choose meaning even if it brings them no happiness, or even less happiness. You know, you keep getting, you're about to get fired from your job at the Washington Post because you're constantly campaigning for a green earth, and it's going to cost you a lot of happiness. But a lot of people, I want to claim, run their life around meaning, even if it brings them no happiness, no good relations, no accomplishment. Similarly, the example I gave was forced to of cheating in bridge or accumulating money is an argument that there are many people who choose victory, winning, accomplishment, even if it brings them no happiness. So an important different move between what Root is after and I'm after is I'm after choice, and I don't believe that happiness is the final common path to choice. I think it's just one of the paths to choice by definition of the element search. Another aspect, which is the public policy aspect, so the incarnation of Root in public policy is my friend Richard Laird. And Richard not only wants to take Root's approach to happiness as a final common path, but he also wants to say that is the be-all and end-all of public policy. So if you want to know whether or not to build a park or a school, and you've got a choice about resources, what you really want to do is ask the question, how much happiness, how much more happiness one will produce than the other. And one of the things that I think exposes why that's not a adequate notion of public policy, and it also is highly relevant to the question of what's an element, is this naked fact that extroverted people are more happy than introverted people. So if you build a park and you look at the extroverts and you ask how many units of happiness does that increase, they're going to show you more increases in introverts. Now, that's a problem because it overcounts extroverts and undercounts introverts. If, however, you rate meaning and engagement and relationships and accomplishment, then I think you erase the overcounting of extroverts. Okay, so this is the end of part one. I've argued that PERMA, positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishment are elements which I'm attempting to say are exclusive, and it would be very nice if they were exhaustive, of what free people choose to do. Okay, so that's part one, and positive emotion is only one of those elements. So that's the view. Now, part two is the question which is highly related, and that's how do you combine these things? So I've said there are 5 things, PERMA, that you really want to measure to get a theory of human choice. But if you're a government or a company or an individual, how do you combine these things in your life? If I'm saying these are all 5 desiderata, they're 5 elements. Well, there are 2 combinatorial views. One is the final common path view of Laird, and I think of, in many ways, of Ken's theory of positive affect minus negative affect plus life satisfaction will result in one number. I think that's a mistake. So I'd like to suggest a dashboard approach. So consider the dashboard of an airplane. I'm making a lot of this up. I don't really know what's on the dashboard of an airplane, but I think it has a fuel gauge, RPMs, wind speed, outside temperature, an altimeter, what height you're at. It doesn't make any sense to ask in vacuo, how is the airplane doing? So there's no one number that combines all the stuff on the dashboard of an airplane. Rather, a pilot, think of piloting your own life or a company or a nation, wants to look at these things separately. So for some missions, altimeter is very important. For other missions, how fast you're going to get there, headwind and RPMs is very important. For other missions, gas gauge is very important. So I want to say you need a dashboard. And then the question is, how do you manage this in your own life or for a company? And here's where this is my main comment on Valerie's presentation on the place of values in human choice. How do you, PERMA, important for your life, how do you weight each of these things in your life? How do you value each of these things in your life? These are statistically often called beta weights. Well, some people like Mother Teresa, as best I can tell, her beta weight for meaning was it, and the beta weight for almost everything else in her life was 0. Other people, the caricature of hedonists, their beta weight on positive emotion is extremely high. Their beta weight on meaning is very low. The place of value in this theory is the beta weight that you put on each of these elements. Now, does that make this a prescriptive or normative theory? I don't think it makes it prescriptive. I think it remains a descriptive theory. So the theory says, let's take the case, let's say I'm a therapist or the prime minister of a nation. So I'm a therapist. I want to find out PERMA, that's my formulation about what a good life would be for my patient. And so I want to ascertain what her values are for each of those 5 things. And it could be 0.2 for each of them, but mostly with people, they value one more than another. My job as a therapist is not a normative job. It is basically to say, okay, given Mother Teresa that all you care about in life is meaning, I'm not here to change your values. I'm not doing something prescriptive. Basically, if this is what you value, I'm going to tell you what we know about how to have more meaning or less meaning in your life and what the consequences of meaning are. So I want to say, Valerie, that the place of values in my theory is that one describes the values that a nation might have. I think what the beta weights are for Denmark, for example, are different from the beta weights for Japan. And what a good prime minister would do is ask the question, well, empirically, how do we bring those things about, given that's the beta weights of the population? So I want to say that flourishing theory, well-being theory, is descriptive and not prescriptive. It describes and implements what is prescribed by a given person or a given corporation or a given nation. So the theory, Valerie, I want to say, is not suffused by value. Value is not inherent in it. Rather, it's informed by value. Okay, so that's the third thing I wanted to say. So the final thing I wanted to say you will find weird, and I'll try to find a way to say it. And I think it's teed up really by the importance of agency and autonomy in self-determination theory and in other things I've done. So this is for philosophers the question of how do notions of will fit into this theory. So, 12 years ago when I started to think seriously about the positive side of life, I said to myself that the great mistake of psychology as usual was that it didn't take the positive side of life seriously, that it was all about suffering and misery. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought that was actually the secondary mistake. And there was an even bigger mistake underneath psychology and social science. And it's a mistake that starts with our 19th century education, the great figures of the 19th century, Darwin, Marx, and Freud, all of whom one way or another told us that the future is determined by the past. For Marx, it was history and class. For Darwin, it's the genetic past. For Freud, it's childhood, unresolved conflicts about sex and other important topics. I think this is profoundly mistaken. I think the past is overrated. I think childhood is overrated. And I want to say something like we're born yesterday. Now that, I'm sure, sounds completely untenable to you. And let me say why I think this is a plausible view of what humans do. So I want to say that we must, I don't want to exclude the past remotely at all. I want to put it in its place. And then I want to say, by and large, we're drawn into the future. We're pulled into the future. And this is where the place of agency occurs. So let me say why this is not as wild as it sounds. What's so attractive about Freud, Marx, Darwin, and in general, all views of hard determinism is Laplace's claim in the 17th century that if you knew the position and momentum of every particle in the universe at a given time, you could predict all of the future and postdict all of the past. And I suspect in many ways deep down, as intellectuals, that's probably what you believe. I believe this is complete hokum, both philosophically and descriptively. There has never, so it's the billiard ball view of science, and the billiard ball view is inherent to this. There has never been and never will be a billiard ball science. There's something called the three-body problem, which is essentially starts it off, but no one's ever been able to predict what the path of billiard balls is going to be when you break a pack of billiard balls. Physics gave up on that a long time ago. Every science that exists is statistical in nature. Sometimes it's 0.99 prediction, but usually, good science, 0.3, 0.9. Now, that's not trivial. I want to say that's not just epistemological. It's not just a measurement issue. It's ontological. Here's what I mean by that. If the best we can ever do in principle in any science we know is statistical prediction, when you're trying to predict the future, you are at best multiplying a bunch of 0.9s at very best by each other. And as you know, when you multiply a bunch of 0.9s together, when you get up to 10 of these things, you have no prediction at all. Well, that should be worrisome for a Laplacian view. So I want to say that hard determinism is completely undermined by the fact that all science is statistical, and there is no billiard ball science. If that's the case, there is no case for hard determinism that I can think of. Now, I'm going to evade soft determinism for a moment in questions of responsibility and the like. So that's part one of my argument that we're drawn by the future, that the past really is quite weak, I want to say. Secondly, the second part of the argument has to do with what you're doing is phenomenological. Those of you who are listening, what are you doing in your heads now when I'm talking? Well, I believe what you're doing is running simulations of the future. What you could say to your class about Laplace, or, geez, I can't, this is all nonsense. I can't wait till he goes to some other topic. But in general, I think what you're doing with your prefrontal cortex, by and large, is running simulations, counterfactual simulations about the future, and then, and this, Ken, is the place of agency, making decisions among them for action. So I think the three claims I want to make about being pulled by the future are that it's just turned out that sciences that try to predict the future by the past, Freudian theory, learning theory being two great examples of this, were colossal failures. But it's worse than that. All of you grew up with social force views of history. And so if you listen to my economist friends talking about economic projections, by and large, they're within a school of thought that says it's the historical forces and the social forces that predict the future. Well, I was at a talk recently by a couple of them, and they projected our economic statistics. And I said, well, to zero, basically. If you took these statistics about Germany in 1937, it would have predicted that I'd be dead and we'd all be doing this in German right now. And what it failed to take into account, what are technically called attractors. Attractors, as I understand it, are things that consolidate vectors of the past and throw them in a different direction. In this case, it was Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt who were the attractors who changed the course of history. So I want to say that social force views of history, social and economic forces, are in fact empirically very weak predictors of the future. And there's a missing element. So Ken, I want to say that missing element is human agency. And so crucial to this notion that we're drawn into the future is the notion that when we make simulations of the future, which is, I think, this higher order prefrontal stuff that we're doing, we then make decisions about which of those we're going to follow. So when I did psychology as usual and just worked on misery, it was perfectly possible to have a view of human action in which brick walls just fell on you, and that's why you were depressed. You didn't need concepts of will and agency. But since before Aristotle, we've known that if you're going to talk about the good life and values, you have to choose those things. And so for me, it's been from the beginning that notions of decision, preference, choice, and will were essential to any positive psychology. And I think where it fits is a theory in which human beings are drawn into the future as opposed to just being driven by the past. Thank you.